25 years later, and a phenomenal number of recordings. 25 recordings.
Yeah.
Which is nowadays, in our world, is no mean undertaking, not only to be able to prepare that much music, but to find the financial support and sponsorship for it, which is very much, it's not like the golden days of Deutsche Grammophon where, every cab fare would be paid by the record company. Those days are long behind us. So, chapeau for so much work to achieve that.
Thank you.
Your players, the players that we heard last night, are they a regular group of musicians, or do you have a larger pool that you draw from according to the needs of any particular program?
Both. We have core players, about 15, and then there's a larger pool also because some of the repertoire we do is larger. For example, we finished the season in Cleveland in April with a Beethoven program, Egmont Overture, Fifth Symphony, Beethoven Violin Concerto. So for that, we had 50 musicians on stage. But for the most part on tour, it's the core group. In this particular case, some of my core players who would have loved to be here could not be here because of prior summer commitment. So we actually were including a couple of our young artist apprentices last night, including Alan Chu, who was a soloist in spring. He's a young artist, yeah.
Jeannette, earlier Tony alluded to this idea of reconstruction of early music, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit, I'm just curious and wonder if maybe other people are too, about the role of musicology in your position.
Sure.
And kind of how you walk that line between preparing music and actually finding and reconstructing and making music.
Sure, yeah. That's the funnest part of my job, I think. I often feel like I get to be a detective and sort of hunting out not only how music was played, but also finding neglected repertoire that in some cases is incredibly great, but has been neglected in modern times because it doesn't really work so well on modern instruments. So that would be Monteverdi and Praetorius, for example. I spent several days in 2005 in the Oberlin library researching Praetorius and Rosenmüller and all of the early 17th century German composers because I wanted to create a new Christmas program that would be an alternative to Messiah. I didn't want to do Messiah every year because I love Messiah and I didn't want our audience to get sick of it. For example, Praetorius or Monteverdi, you see this huge score with many, many different parts for many different singers who have independent parts and many instruments, none of which is specified. And for the most part, he doesn't even tell you whether this line should be played by a violin or a cornetto or something else. Should these parts be sung one on a part, or is this a choral section? He really doesn't tell you. There are 1,000 decisions you have to make. You basically have to make your own edition of the music and create your own what we call parts, what the musicians play from. It's a huge undertaking, and I wondered if anyone would come to this, in December of 2008. And to the credit of the Cleveland public, they all showed up, and they loved it, and we've repeated the program many, many times since then. But that's just one example of the kind of work that we do that is, musicology research, but definitely with the goal of creating a compelling program.
And is that a process that includes members of the orchestra as well? Do they bring pieces to the attention of you and the rest of the ensemble?
Occasionally, less so with Baroque programming, but in Apollo's Fire, we also do historical folk music in the summertime mostly. The encore that we played last night is an example of that. And with that repertoire, definitely I very much collaborate with the musicians who are from particular traditions. So, for example, Susanna, who played the solo in Summer Concerto last night, she grew up as a Celtic fiddler. She lived in England for a long time, and so she suggested to me several Irish fiddle tunes that we have used in Sugarloaf Mountain.
Fantastic. Well, we have really a great debt to the early music movement for bringing back a lot of music that was really forgotten, or for which the way of performing them wasn't known, and we didn't know. Like you mentioned, Couperin, for instance, earlier on, who was one of the great composers of the time, the performances of whose music was sort of lost somewhere along the line. So, not only detective work, but great love. You've started, in addition to your work with Apollo's Fire and with early music movement, you've started to work with some modern day orchestras. Mm-hmm. And I'd be really interested to hear how that process is for you in terms of preparation, the sorts of things that you talk about with musicians who are typically not playing on replicas of early instruments, and how that crossover all takes place, if crossover is the right terminology.
Sure, yeah. That's a really interesting topic. My first kind of serious guest engagement was with the Pittsburgh Symphony 4 years ago, doing the complete Brandenburgs, which is kind of a huge thing to take on as your first concert with any major orchestra. But that was what they asked me to do. And so I did prepare for it in a different way than I would with Apollo's Fire. And what I do with these orchestras is I'm very careful about marking a lot of things into the parts that they're playing from. All kinds of dynamics and phrasing and articulation, meaning whether you play the notes short or long or smooth or detached. And also some sort of code symbols, which I then explain to them at the first rehearsal. Because with a modern bow, you can, in fact, produce the sounds that a Baroque bow produces, but it doesn't happen as naturally, and so you have to kind of manipulate the modern bow to work against its natural inclinations. Because a modern bow is meant to sustain all the time and send the sound out in a large hall in a very sustained way. But in Baroque music, what you want is for the sound to decay so that you can hear the inner voices and all the counterpoint that's going on. And if you play in the sustained way, then you get a muddy performance of Baroque music. And it doesn't have much lilt, you know? So I have a vocabulary of shapes of notes that we work on with the bow, such as the whale shape, which kind of looks like this, like the shape of a whale. And it's the shape that a Baroque bow naturally produces, meaning that there's a round attack to the sound, which is the nose of the whale, and his head, and then there's this severe decay to the sound at the end, which is the tail of the whale, so it gets softer. And so we work at the first rehearsal on doing this with a modern bow, and you can do it, it's just that it's different than what players are used to. Things like that, yeah.
And how much time did you have, say, preparing all of the Brandenburg concertos in Pittsburgh?
4 rehearsals, so that was pretty scary. But since then, I've done St. Paul Chamber Orchestra and Seattle Symphony and New World Symphony, and so each time, you know, preparing a new piece for a group like that is a lot of work, a lot of time marking a lot of things into the parts, and thinking about how to rehearse it in a very efficient way. But then once I've done a piece like that once, you know, it's very easy to take it to the next orchestra.
When we talked about the possibility of Apollo's Fire coming here to Tanglewood this summer, you, with enormous efficiency, sent me a list of about 5 or 6 possible programs. This lady is the most wonderful person to work with for an artistic administrator.
I'm glad to hear
in
that.
that she is not only super efficient, but she understands all of the nuances of our sorts of issues. So she sent about 5 or 6 different possible programs, and I looked at them and thinking about the occasion last night, which was the first real recital program of the season in Ozawa Hall, which we wanted to be a particularly strong and festive occasion. Thinking about the program that you played here a couple of weeks ago, we ended up with the program including Vivaldi's Four Seasons, which, you know, many think is sort of ubiquitous, that we hear it all the time, but in fact I had to go back and check, and there hasn't been a performance of the Four Seasons here at Tanglewood in my 23 summers. So,
oh my gosh, wow.
So not quite what you think. And I also had a sense of how you might just go about presenting it to us last night. And this gets me onto the very sensitive subject of speech from the stage in concerts, which I, as many of you know, I feel very ambivalent about, because two things: it needs to be done extremely well, and second, there's always a problem of amplified speech and then acoustic music, and how do the two fit together. But the way you did it last night was superb in every sense. But it's clearly a format that you came to after a lot of trial and error and working with the music and the musicians.
Yes, and frankly, I so much agree with, you don't really want to have booming spoken voice and then a soft-sounding orchestra. So as much as possible when I'm speaking from the stage, I try to do it without a mic, up to maybe an 800-seat hall, so that it's more natural. But, obviously in a hall that's open to the lovely green grass, have to be mic'd. Over the years in Cleveland, I guess I had a mission of wanting to bring Baroque music to everyone, to a grassroots audience. And I'm the daughter of 2 professors, and I grew up going to tons and tons of what you might call academic early music concerts in a college chapel, attended by 52.5 people. And that is not what I wanted to do, because I think this music is beautiful and moving and deep and life-affirming, and it should be brought to everyone. And so that is how I came to start talking to the audience from the stage, so that I could help people connect with the music and kind of give them a window into the music by means of a context, whether it's what's going on in the life of the composer at the time, or what was going on in society, maybe in the political life or the theatrical life. We also do a lot of things using the space creatively. If we're performing in cathedrals or something, we have often some kind of procession or recession, depending on what the program calls for. Things like that.
At the performance last night, there were 3 soloists doing the solo parts in the Four Seasons, and I wonder, how did that decision process come about? How did you select them? It seemed very democratic. Maybe it was just that kind of internal process. Just curious if you can talk a little bit about that.
Playing the Four Seasons on period instruments live, playing the solos of all 4 concertos on a Baroque violin live is quite a huge undertaking. It's one thing to record them when you can keep doing it over and fixing it. It's another thing to do it live. Baroque instruments are, there's no chin rest, and so the shifting is very precarious to play in high positions. The strings don't really stay in tune. And so to give all 4 of them to one person, it seemed to me, especially in an outdoor venue with humidity and all of that, is just like a little too much, So we split it up, and I think it was fun to see different personalities coming to these pieces.
Yeah, I think so too. But it's interesting to hear you say that, because from an audience perspective, the thought was that if one person had done it, they would have gotten all the glory, and what you're describing is all of the burden, which is completely the opposite.
I guess both are true.
For as familiar as the Four Seasons may be, I was struck again last night by the incredible energy in that music. It's got extraordinary sort of thrust forward, and it was fascinating to hear those pieces in contrast with the other two double concertos that you played. How did the idea of this pairing of pieces within the program come about?
Well, I always like to include the concerto for two cellos along with the Four Seasons, because if you're listening to all of this violin sound, you want to hear some low sounds as a break, right? My beloved partner, Jeff, over here is a baritone, and he gets very tired of violin sounds and wants to hear some low sounds. But I know that he's not alone. So that was part of it. And then I thought it would just be nice to bring in some flutes because, again, for a timbre change and just to make the group a little larger in what for us is a kind of large hall. So.
Well, look, we've got a couple of questions here, which is a couple of them are rather technical.
Okay.
But we'll start with the less technical ones, which is sort of from the point where you were, of your last comment, and someone's mentioned that you are, as a conductor, you seem exceptionally graceful, almost like a dancer, a ballet dancer. And did you ever study ballet at any stage?
Yeah. It was a very big part of my life, actually. I probably spent too much time in the dance studio and not enough time practicing the violin. I grew up as a pianist and a violinist and a dancer, but I never practiced the violin. But yes, so I was, in the Nutcracker every year. I was a mouse, and then I was a soldier, and then I was a gingerbread person, and et cetera. When I was at Oberlin doing an artist diploma, my mentor and conducting teacher was Robert Spano, who is a major figure at Tanglewood. He's a dear friend of mine. He was only a few years older than me at the time, but he was faculty, and he was working with me to try to get me to have a stance as a conductor that would be more suitable for Brahms and Shostakovich, and my feet go into fourth position. It's just what's there. And Bob was so frustrated that my feet kept doing that. And so in a rehearsal, at one point he took off his shoe and threw it at my feet to remind me to put them straight. And he missed. And the shoe struck a cello of a cello student. And she immediately burst into tears. She was so frightened about the sound, this like projectile suddenly striking her cello. And the rehearsal ground to a halt. And this event became legendary at Oberlin. And years later, when Apollo's Fire made our debut at Aspen, Bob was there conducting, and there was this Oberlin and Aspen party. And all these students from the younger generation were bombarding us and wanting to know if this legend that they had heard was true, that Bob had thrown his shoe at me and struck a cello. It was true.
I'd ask him for a big donation. But on a similar theme, someone's noted that you stood to play and conduct last night. Is that your own decision, or is that something that commonly happens in the period instrument world?
It's kind of my own thing, although I think McGuigan also at least sometimes does it. But I don't always stand, but I find when the group is more than 12 players, then it seems helpful to stand just to have better eye contact with everybody. If you're sitting, it works for a group of maybe 10 to 12, but not more. I started doing the standing thing more when I started working with symphony orchestras, and then I thought, this is really good, so I started doing it with Apollo's Fire too.
Well, a couple of technical questions now, and you can probably reply to these in fairly fast order. The BSO tunes to a pitch of 441, A441. What about Apollo's Fire?
It depends on the repertoire. Bach is A415, which is half a step lower. Vivaldi, we actually do at 440 because it's Italian, and you judge the pitch based on really how composers wrote for singers. If you do Italian music at 415, it's just too low for the singers. French music, Baroque music, is even lower pitch, 392. And we do Monteverdi at 466.
466?
Well, at least we will be this coming year, yeah, or 440 sometimes.
Wow.
Yeah.
For those high tenors to
Yep.
be up there.
Yep.
Okay, the string instruments last night, did they have gut strings or steel strung strings?
Gut strings.
Gut strings, okay. Here's another very interesting question for you. We're just speaking of Bach. Would you ever consider doing an orchestral version of the Goldberg Variations?
Well,
one does exist.
Does it?
I think, yes.
Wow.
Let me get back to you about whom, but
Okay.
yes.
This is why you have a great artistic administrator here, because he knows the repertoire incredibly well. I don't know. I probably would never take on arranging that piece by myself, but I'd be interested to see what exists.
It's so bound up with keyboard figuration that
is.
it's hard to imagine. How do you recruit players to the orchestra?
How do I recruit players? Well, I mean, I mostly look for players who are expressive on stage and who are making music, not just doing a job, right? So these days, I often do preliminary auditions on video, on YouTube. I'll scope out what somebody has been doing. I also don't like to have people prepare for months and months for an audition. In the symphony orchestra world, you know, the excerpt list is published months in advance, and people spend months practicing these excerpts. I don't like to do that because if they're going to be working in Apollo's Fire, they're not going to be practicing these pieces for months. It's not realistic. So it's more of a spontaneous thing, but a lot of it has to do with personality. But certainly the technical standard has to be there, and you know they have to absolutely be able to play consistently in tune, or forget it.
Here's another interesting question, which may be our last one, because you could perhaps go on forever with your answer to this. There was, in the program notes last night, there was an anecdote about Vivaldi midway through saying Mass, leaving to write down a musical idea that had come into his head. So at that point, he chose music over religion, in other words. How do you figure the whole spiritual dimension of life, of religion in your work as a player and as a conductor and artist?
Well, I actually came into music through church music. When I was 14, I had my first job, which was playing the piano for a church. And I started directing an instrumental ensemble when I was in high school at my church. And so I've always been involved with sacred music. I've always especially loved conducting sacred music, such as the Passions of Bach. I feel that's perhaps what I do best. You know, when you're conducting sacred music or performing it, the goal is to try to get everybody in the room to connect with something that's universal, right? Tap into something that we all share that represents what's best about humanity. And doing that is a great joy and a great privilege. So every time we do, you know, a Bach Passion or the Mozart Requiem or something like that, those are the moments you live for as a performer, at least for some of us. Yeah.
I think it's a wonderful thought to leave us with. Jeannette Sorrell, thank you for being our guest today. Have a great time.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
See you next week.